Welcome to The Wrap. My name is Paul Spey, here with Will Doran. We are WRAL state government reporters here to tell you about the week in politics in North Carolina. It is Friday, November 22nd. We are more than 2 weeks after the election, but some races have still not been called. The highest profile being the North Carolina Supreme Court race. There are 7 seats on the state Supreme Court. Only one of them is up for election, and it is not decided yet. Well, this is also an area of contention where there have been lots of lawsuits. Can you tell us what's going on there?
Yes, this is, and you know what? This is also bleeding over into a little bit of what some critics are calling an attempted power grab at the legislature. We can get into that later. But yes, 5.5 million people voted in the race for state Supreme Court this year. And Allison Riggs, the Democratic incumbent, is up by 625 votes. Not 625,000, 625 total.
Right. Less than 1,000. Far less. It's not even 1 percentage point. It's like 0.00001 something percent of the vote. It's just a minuscule amount. And so, you know, her Republican opponent, Jefferson Griffin, has obviously called for a recount. And we've actually, you know, if this sounds familiar to people, we've done this in the past. In 2020, not that long ago, another race for seat on the Supreme Court, actually that year it was the Chief Justice seat, that went down to 401 votes that Republican Paul Newby ended up winning by. And that recount that year, it changed, you know, it changed the numbers a little bit, but not by a ton. You know, we're talking a handful of votes, not several hundred. So unless there were serious issues this year, a recount probably is not going to change Riggs's victory. But what could change and potentially give Griffin the victory is a lawsuit, or not a lawsuit, a election protest that Griffin has filed alleging that state officials improperly counted 60,000 ballots or so this year. Right. And for the Elections Board, this is a familiar argument. One of the things, obviously, Jefferson Griffin has pointed out, you know, where people voted who were felons, who were not allowed to vote, or some people died, you know, between casting a ballot and then Election Day. But one thing he's arguing is that some people who voted didn't provide the correct ID when they registered. So it wasn't about Election Day or when they cast their ballot this year. It goes back to when they registered to vote. And that's been a contention of the Republican Party, like the state GOP and even the Republican National Committee, dating back a couple months, right? What didn't they already bring this challenge before the Elections Board and before the courts before now?
Yes, this is something that essentially has already been shot down by both the State Board of Elections and in federal court. But they're trying again because, you know, might as well. And it's a contention that North Carolina basically hasn't done enough to validate the identity of all of the voters by collecting either their driver's license number or their social security number when they first signed up to vote. And that didn't used to be required, but then in the early 2000s, the federal government passed a law that did require it. So state officials say, yeah, you know, if someone signed up to vote before, you know, 2002, 2003, whenever this law changed, then they did not have to provide that. And, you know, if they haven't moved since then, you know, if they still live in the same place and change, you know, we can't just go and kick down their door and, you know, make them give us this information.
They say basically they're grandfathered in.
Exactly.
Like if you were allowed to register under old rules, then you're registered.
Exactly. And so this spring, actually, a conservative activist filed a complaint about this with the State Board of Elections. And the Elections Board voted unanimously. The Democrats and the Republicans on the board all agreed that there was no merit to it, and they dismissed it. Then fast forward a few months to this summer, the NCGOP and the RNC file a lawsuit making essentially the exact same complaint and asking to purge nearly 250,000 voters from the voter rolls that they said here in North Carolina didn't have this information. Now,
that case was heard by Judge Richard Myers, who's actually a Donald Trump appointee from Donald Trump's first term in office. And he dismissed that request and actually said that it runs counter to the very principles of democracy, basically what they were asking him to do. He said, no, you can't you can't do this. And then he did send part of their lawsuit back to state court. But then even that lost when it went up on appeal. The federal appeals court said, no, state court doesn't need to handle this. This is an issue for federal courts, and it's not a thing. So basically, everyone who's looked at this, including a lot of Republican officials, have decided that there's really not a whole lot of merit to this claim. But it is a centerpiece of Griffin's challenges here.
Right. And then the other is this year they're counting provisional ballots, and this is the first year, the first general election, I think, where voter ID has been the law. And so my understanding is there are some provisional ballots where, they have to go back and see if people were presented proper ID. But with 625 votes between them, I think that's the same as it was last week. What's new this week is things have gotten ugly, right? People, including Senate Leader Phil Berger, made a comment this week about the Democratic-controlled Board of Elections, quote, finding votes, I'm paraphrasing here, or something like that.
Yes, he was talking clearly about this Supreme Court recount and venting some frustration and said, well, you just have this, these Democrats, counting votes until the candidate that you want to win wins. And, they have to count all the votes. That is the job of the county elections officials. They don't count votes until a certain candidate wins. They count all the votes.
Right.
And during this process, plenty of Republicans also ended up winning races. It's not just the Supreme Court race that wound up, with Riggs in the lead.
Right. And we should point out, too, that when this happened in the year 2020, when there was that close state Supreme Court Chief Justice race that was separated by 400 votes, that recount went into December. In fact, Democrat Sherry Beasley didn't concede until December 12th, at least according to WRAL's archives here. So this one could be in for another 2 weeks. But that Berger's comment, I think, struck a chord this year with the executive director and other leaders at the State Board of Elections who, are in the middle of doing their job. It's a big, demanding job. They get lots of criticism all the time. But Bell penned a letter back to Berger, and what exactly did she say to him?
It was, your classic strongly worded letter, but it was pretty strongly worded. I mean, she said you need to publicly take this back. People actually believe what you say, even when what you say is false, and this could end up in violence against election workers. And she, included kind of a snippy rejoinder at the end. I believe you're a lawyer, but if you need me to come and explain to you how laws work, I will be happy to do that. Just let me know.
Oh, my.
So, this is, in the past, the elections board has tried to be polite with the state legislature, but this is very much a departure from that. It really seems that, with all of these lawsuits that the GOP has been filing and complaints against the elections board, and then, making public statements like this, accusing them of committing voter fraud, it seems that this has just sort of pushed officials over the edge.
Right.
And then, of course, this all comes on the backdrop of they just passed this massive bill this week that would, change the control of the elections board, but also change a whole lot of elections procedures, really technical stuff that Karen Brinson-Bell, the head of the elections board, told me nobody in the legislature asked for input on, and will end up with a lot of votes she believes that are valid being thrown out in the future.
Let's go back. Speaking of sour grapes, with Berger making his remark about the state Supreme Court race. Also this week, he was in town because they had another Hurricane Helene relief bill to consider. But people didn't realize, that I didn't realize at least, us in the media, that it was not only going to include relief for Helene. It included newly proposed laws for the Elections Board, as you mentioned, and for the governor, and I believe the lieutenant governor as well,
and the Attorney General. All 3 offices won by Democrats in the most recent elections. Can you walk us through some of those changes?
Yes, this was a 131-page bill that the legislature only made public maybe an hour before they voted on it, which is, not the typical process. When, Democrats had a lot of complaints about that. And, of course, the public has no way of knowing what's in this thing. We were leaked a copy. Thank you to people who support the media and like to leak us documents.
Yes, please leak all of your documents to us at WRAL. We have a digital website and a television station to get it out to as many people as possible.
Nice pitch there.
Thank you.
But so we were able to go through and analyze some of this before the vote and, tell people what was coming. And yes, it basically takes away most of the powers of the Attorney General's office. They are really going after Jeff Jackson in this bill. We've always had Democratic attorneys general here in North Carolina. So, we asked Senator Berger, what's different about Jeff Jackson that, even Josh Stein or Roy Cooper, who the legislature has not gotten along with, you didn't feel the need to just completely strip the office of all of its powers.
Right. His predecessors.
Right, exactly. And he said, well, we really disliked a lot of the things that Josh Stein did when he was AG. And, if Dan Bishop had won the race, the Republican candidate, maybe we wouldn't have done this. But, Jeff Jackson, we see him as probably just continuing down the path of doing things that we don't like. And so we don't think he should have the power to do that.
And they know Jeff Jackson because he used to be in the legislature before running for Congress and winning, where he is now for another, month before taking the Attorney General's office.
Yes. And then so this, in addition to really targeting the AG's office, it would also take away the governor's control over the elections board. Right now, the parties, nominate folks, but the majority on these boards, both the state and all the county boards have 5 members. Democrats get 3 and Republicans get 2 because the governor is a Democrat. And that's how state law has worked for years. Republicans have tried to change this, but their efforts keep getting ruled unconstitutional in court. They tried to then change the state constitution with an amendment that voters shot down. And so they are continuously stymied, basically, in their attempts over the last decade to take away the governor's power over the elections board. But they think they've found a solution this time that has a better chance of working because instead of trying to take the power for themselves, which they've tried to do in the past, and move it from the executive branch to the legislative branch, now they're proposing keeping it in the executive branch, but just with an official who's a Republican. So they're going to give it to State Auditor Dave Bullock when he takes office next year. And, of course, I should note that this is all if this bill becomes law and if this survives the lawsuits that are certain to happen if it does become law. So, none of this is set in stone yet, but these are the proposals that did pass the legislature this week along party lines.
And amid, I would say, some drama with people in the gallery there at the legislature there to protest not just this bill but other things. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll tell you about the other reasons that the protesters packed the gallery and the other bill they were protesting. Stick around. Welcome back. We just talked about some of the legislation that Republican state lawmakers are trying to enact into law that take away powers from these soon-to-be Democratic officials in the governor's office and the attorney general's office and over at the State Board of Elections. But now let's talk about a bill that they did enact into law this week by overriding a veto from Roy Cooper, our governor. That's House Bill 10. Will, this bill, from my understanding, did 2 big things. One was expand funding for the Opportunity Scholarship Program that allows people to apply for public funding when they apply for a private school. They can use it on tuition for private school. And the other is to require North Carolina sheriffs to detain people who are wanted by ICE. If you want to talk about the voucher part of this and why it's so controversial, And why now? Why in November was this bill passed and not before the election? I think that would be very interesting.
Yeah. So, as part of the normal budget process, the state has set aside, many tens, hundreds of millions of dollars for vouchers. And what they did last year was basically take the guardrails off the program. In the past, you had to, only have a certain income level to qualify. You had to have, tried public schools in the past. It was really a program for lower income families who wanted the chance to not have to send their kids to public schools anymore for whatever reason.
Right. And they sort of had to prove that they had tried, but their kids' needs weren't being met. Right?
Exactly. And so last year they eliminated all those rules. So they said, even if you have always sent your kids to private school, even if you are a multimillionaire, you can qualify for these vouchers.
Even if your kid has no special needs or anything like that, go ahead and apply.
Exactly. And so that created a gigantic surge in demand for vouchers from people who didn't previously qualify, but after they changed all those rules, now they do qualify. And there wasn't enough money in the program. And so there was a wait list. And so GOP leaders said, okay, we need to take care of this wait list. But then in the backdrop of all of it, there was a whole lot of squabbling over the state budget, and they couldn't figure out a budget deal to pass.
Oh, goodness.
And so, they had to figure out some way to get this voucher money passed because it's something that the Republicans have campaigned on hard. And, some of their biggest political donors are, people who support the school choice movement, people who own private schools. And so they said, look, our supporters expect us to do this. And so they end up tacking this extra funding for vouchers onto this immigration bill that deals with sheriffs and ICE.
Right.
And so that's why it sounds kind of completely unrelated because it is, but that's just how the legislature works.
Right. You have to, when something is held up, you have to use special tricks. You ask your local lawyer for what special tricks are in his bag that you can use to get your legislation passed. Speaking of things that have been wanted, the part about requiring sheriffs to cooperate with immigration officials has been something they've been working on for years, dating back to when you and I both worked at the local newspaper here.
Roy Cooper has vetoed this 2 or 3 times, I
Right.
think. This was just the first time that they've actually been able to override that veto.
I think he vetoed it 3 times. And back in 2019 is when it was first brought up. And it's really interesting to think about how the context has changed. In 2018, the ACLU and Democrats were able to defeat sheriffs in Wake County and Mecklenburg County, where Charlotte is, who had cooperated with the federal government because there was this, Donald Trump was president. He obviously ran on a more anti-immigration platform. Well, there was this, big pushback across the country by Democrats. And here in North Carolina, the 2 biggest urban areas decided they were going to take out their sheriffs who helped Donald Trump. And they did. And so that was 2018. The very next year, Republican state lawmakers introduced this bill that would force sheriffs to keep someone in their jail if ICE requested them to. Now, there's a legal issue with this. People have pointed out that, if someone makes bail, then many attorneys believe you're sort of obligated to release them, right?
Right, or say that you're arrested for something and sent to jail, but then they figure out that they've got the wrong person or that they don't actually have the evidence against you, so they dismiss the charges against you. You're free to go. And then in this case, no, you're not. If ICE says, hey, we think this person might be here illegally, they can request that the sheriff keep you behind bars even after you should have gone free. Yeah, maybe you made bail, maybe you had your charges dismissed, maybe you finished serving your time.
Right.
And so there are constitutional questions. Some sheriffs have said, hey, if we get sued over this, we're going to be the ones paying the bill for that lawsuit. It's not ICE who's going to be paying the bill.
Right.
It's going to be, your county government.
Who has far less money than the federal government.
Exactly. But Republicans say that doesn't matter, that public safety is much more important than these legalese concerns about, people's, rights to not be held for longer than they should be, and that we need to, be helping get undocumented immigrants out. Obviously Donald Trump this year has campaigned on a policy of mass deportations of everyone who is in the country illegally, not just if you have a criminal record, but if you're here at all.
Right. And I think that's what's so fascinating about this is that North Carolina Republicans have been trying to force sheriffs to cooperate with ICE for 5 years at least, dating back to 2019. And at that time, public sentiment was anti-Trump. It was that he was doing too much. He has gone too far, and our local sheriffs had gone too far. And that flash forward to today, Donald Trump is president-elect. He's about to take the White House for the second time, and public sentiment, including among some Latino voters, is, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, we need to crack down on immigration again, and that's the context under which this bill has finally become law in the eyes of Republicans, at least. That brought us to today, and there's some other things. Those were the biggest things that happened this week. The Supreme Court race getting ugly, the Helene bill that includes provisions to strip power from Democratic officials. Then this bill that lawmakers were able to override and enact into law, override Cooper's veto, I should say, and enact into law for more private school voucher funding and requiring sheriffs to cooperate with ICE. Speaking of Helene, Governor Cooper and Governor-elect Josh Stein, who's the Attorney General, were in D.C. this week to lobby Congress for more funding, more federal funding for Helene victims in Western North Carolina. Meanwhile, there was a top disaster recovery state official who is now out. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, Laura Hogshead, who for a couple years now has been in charge of the state's rebuilding efforts after natural disasters, which of course is mostly so far focused on eastern North Carolina, but is now unfortunately also going to be focusing on western North Carolina. She is gone from that job, and this comes after a very slow response from the Cooper administration in getting people's homes rebuilt out in eastern North Carolina after Hurricanes Matthew and Florence back in 2016 and 2018. And, what we've heard from lawmakers at the legislatures, as Democrats are slamming the Republicans for not spending enough money on Helene aid here in North Carolina, the Republicans are saying, hey, look at what happened after Hurricane Matthew, after Hurricane Florence. There's people who still 6-8 years later haven't had their house rebuilt. Why is this taking years and years? And you're over budget now, you're telling us? Because that also came out that this agency said, oh, hey, by the way, we are well over $100 million in the red and need some help. And so, GOP leaders were just apoplectic when that happened. And they hauled in both Hogshead and Pryor Gibson, another top official at that rebuild agency, made them testify under oath about all of these things, and then, demanded that she resign. She declined during the meeting, but then pretty quickly afterwards, her resignation was announced.
Right.
So, that is a big win for Republicans who have been hunting for a scalp on this. It's certainly an embarrassment for the Cooper administration, to essentially have to admit defeat on this point, admit that, yes, a change does need to be made. This agency has had a lot of problems because we heard, in this Helene funding bill has about $50 million for this agency. So not all of the money that they had requested, but, what we heard from both Senate Leader Berger and also from Representative Destin Hall, who's the new speaker to be starting in 2025, said, I don't know that I would trust this agency with even $1. But we felt the need that we had to give them at least something because we don't want to punish the people in Western North Carolina for this the mismanagement of this agency. But, the fact that she is now out, it kind of and that also allows, Josh Stein, when he comes in a couple of weeks, is sworn in as governor to put his own stamp on the agency and try to, move on from the scandals of the Cooper administration in that area.
To give people an idea of how big of a deal this hurricane disaster recovery failure in the eyes of Republicans has been, when we've talked to people about Cooper potentially running for U.S. Senate against Tom Tillis in 2026, I spoke to one Republican strategist who said that's what they would lead with. You want to talk about Cooper's record? He has great numbers, great favorables and low unfavorables according to polling, and has for years. He's very popular. But I talked to one strategist who said this is what they would lead with. This is one of the things they would lead with in Cooper's background if he were to run for higher office again.
And Tillis has been out front on this Helene issue, and perhaps it's because he recognizes that exact same thing that you just said. But also, he represents Western North Carolina, and he has said that he does support the Biden administration's ask for $100 billion with a B dollars to be spent on emergency aid, and he said this week, and frankly, we need more. And he's asking for changes to the law to get a little bit more creative with how we do disaster response, maybe taking some cues from COVID, when we had the PPP program that helped people, still get paid even after businesses had to shut down. He was suggesting that maybe we use that after natural disasters to help stop the economy from cratering in a place like Asheville that is so heavily dependent on tourism and the service industry. That is something that Tillis has, really been out front trying to be bipartisan on, backing the Biden administration on this. You and I wrote a story recently about that 2026 race and how Tillis is going to be the most vulnerable U.S. senator up for election anywhere in the country next year.
Right.
That's not to say that his stances on this are not sincere, but it's politics.
Right.
Everything comes with that dressing of looking ahead to 2026.
Right. A couple more notes before we go. Speaking of government inefficiency, there was an audit that came out this week that said the unemployment office in North Carolina has struggled to get unemployment checks out to people in a timely manner. And what's interesting about this is that it was a big problem during 2020 and 2021 when the pandemic happened and unemployment skyrocketed, I think, to almost 14% here in North Carolina. There was a 2022 audit that came in and said, hey, here's some things you guys could do to improve your services so that this doesn't happen again during another economic downturn or something like that. Well, guess what? The auditor's office has been monitoring the unemployment office and found that in 2020, during a relatively a stable economic year, the problem got worse. There were a higher percentage of unemployment checks that went out in 2023 than there were during the pandemic. And so I imagine that's got to be so frustrating for people who are in this state and looking for work and things like that. Now, that office, the Department of Commerce, put out a statement saying, hey, we've had a lot of turnover. That's led to a big problem with filling vacancies. And then when they're on, we have to train them up and things like that. But that came out this week. And then the last note from going back to our election, Josh Stein defeating Mark Robinson in the gubernatorial race. If people will recall, CNN wrote a story alleging that Mark Robinson used an alias to post some sexist and racist comments on a pornographic website. Robinson sued CNN, and can you give us an update on that lawsuit? Obviously, it's possible it played a role in Stein's 15-point victory over Robinson, and I don't know that Robinson's denials helped him all that much. But where are we now?
Yes, CNN is now asking for that lawsuit to be dismissed. The other guy that Robinson sued, Louis Money, who's like the former adult video store clerk, he long ago asked for this lawsuit to be dismissed and kind of laid out his reasons why. But we had never heard from CNN really their full defense of their case and why they presumably think that they are right and Mark Robinson is wrong.
They never even gave us a comment or anything, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, we've been asking, since September, for comment, from CNN responding to Robinson's claims that this was all false and made up and intended to hurt his political career. I'm sure that they saw that a lawsuit was coming and have not commented on it. But so now we see their full argument. This just came out late Thursday, and they say that this is just political theater, is the quote that they used to describe Robinson's claims. They called them implausible at best, and that is a reference to Robinson's theory of the case, basically, because CNN in their article had this whole breakdown explaining how they connected the username on this pornographic website to Mark Robinson himself. It was the same as his Twitter handle. It was on several other social media accounts that used his name, his photo, other biographical details, all of this sort of stuff. And they even connected some Facebook posts that he had made using kind of unique turns of phrase that aren't very common, that all of those same unique or odd phrases also showed up in the comments on this porn site. CNN said, hey, we think that, we have been detectives and we have pieced this all together, and here's our work, we're showing you. Mark Robinson said, well, someone could have used artificial intelligence to essentially fake a profile, making it look like it was me, but it wasn't actually me. And this all happened long before he was a public figure. It's kind of unclear. He doesn't explain why someone would have wanted to do that, which CNN points out several times in their thing, that they said he has this whole theory. He has absolutely no proof for it. He doesn't really even theorize why someone would have done this. This looks more like a publicity stunt than a lawsuit, and therefore, judge, please throw it out. So we have reached out to Robinson's lawyers to see if they want to respond. Obviously they will be responding in court in due time to this, but we have asked for a more immediate comment, have not heard back on that as of the time that we're recording this.
Right. And people may wonder, well, why are we still talking about Robinson? He lost. He was very popular among the Republican base. People have speculated that he could run against Tom Tillis in the Republican primary in 2026 when Tillis is up for re-election. And you spoke to him this week at the legislature when he was presiding over the Senate. You asked him, hey, what are you going to do next?
I believe that was actually our colleague Brian Murphy who spoke with him. But yes, we did talk with him this week at the legislature, and he said, look, running against Tom Tillis, quote, was not on my radar. Robinson has been, put forward by a lot of people in the GOP base who really dislike Tom Tillis and who really like Mark Robinson. They want to see him take on Tillis in this primary in 2026. But according to Robinson himself, that is not something that he is considering doing right now. And he said really any sort of future political plans are not anything that he has been thinking of.
Right. Well, if he does decide to run, people will look back on that CNN story and their allegations, and then how this lawsuit plays out that may factor into his political future. Whatever happens, we'll let you know on future episodes of The Wrap here at WRAL. Thank you, as always, for joining us, and stay tuned. We'll be back soon enough with the latest from North Carolina.